All right, let's move on to the realistic goals. These are the goals that I think we can look at and say these are fair expectations to have. Um, but we're not just like setting ourselves up for failure by dreaming too big. We're not getting out over our skis. Um, these are things that they're absolutely achievable given what we know about the roster and what we know about the schedule right now. They're gonna, they'll obviously take, they'll need to get, they'll need to be sharp. They will need to be, um, they'll need to, limit turnovers, things like that. But these are achievable. Realistic goal number 1, 7-5, beating a rival, and that means beating either Iowa or Kansas State. Obviously, Kansas State is the more likely of those two. Kansas State is at home. It's at the end of the season when you've had a chance to mesh. But I think you can. I think Iowa's gonna be fine. They lost a ton. It's continuity over there. It is what it is. Iowa's just gonna be Iowa's an 8-4 or a 7-5 football team, and what their final record is just depends on how good their schedule is. They're just always an 8-4 football team. And if they get an easy schedule, they'll convert 1 or 2 of those into wins, and they'll go 9-3 or 10-2. If it's a hard schedule, they'll go 7-5. That's just what they do. Now, but you can. It's playing on the road. It's tough, but it's not something they can't do. For what it's worth, this staff last year went into Oxford and nearly beat Ole Miss. They nearly beat James Madison on the road. They played 3 playoff teams within 1 score. And plus, like half the staff played at South Dakota State, North Dakota State, whatever. They played at FCS schools, which specifically FCS schools that are famous for going into Power 5 and G5 opponents to going into their stadiums and beating them. It's North Dakota State made it hay for years on going to Iowa State and Minnesota and Wisconsin and Iowa and whoever else and just beating them in their own stadium. These FCS guys are not scared of going into a big stadium. And if you can play clean football against Iowa and, get a play or two, we'll see. They can, a mobile quarterback can cause a lot of problems, and Jalen Raynor is very mobile. So we'll see what we can do there. But but by the time you get to the end of the season, we'll know more about these teams. Maybe, like I said, maybe Avery Johnson is finally unlocks his potential with Colin Klein. I'm not really a believer in that, but it's possible. But by the end of the season, Iowa State should be playing its best football. Hopefully they're not, hopefully they're not hurt or anything like that. But you should be you'll have a shot to beat Kansas State at home as well. But 7-5, beating a rival is absolutely a doable thing. You can pretty much protect home. Kansas State, Cincinnati, Oklahoma State, Utah, West Virginia, Utah, in the G5 schools. You've got 7 home games. All you got to do is win one road game, and you can afford to lose that Utah game if you want. Next up, realistic goal number 2, a top 40 defense and a top 50 offense. Again, we're kind of going by metrics here. So a top 40, like I said, Iowa State last year was the 37th offense, the 41st defense. Basically, what I'm asking is to do that again. If you can basically replicate Iowa State's efficiency on either side of the ball last year and just do it again, I think you're in a good spot. You don't even need, even if they're top 40, even if they're just top 40 defense, top 50 offense, that's going to be good enough that if you're not penalizing yourself, if you're not eating a bunch of turnovers, if you're doing the little things well, you're playing good special teams, a top 40 defense and a top 50 offense should get you to 7-5. That's a kind of above average on both of those. I really see those as very achievable. Like I said, a mobile quarterback fixes a lot of problems on offense. And if the offensive line can start getting together, sometime in September, and they can at least get a running game going with Aiden Flora or Cameron Petaway, any number of these guys. I really think that is a doable number, and those two numbers, a top 40 defense and a top 50 offense, I believe both of those will get you to 7-5 with that schedule. Especially if you can just eliminate or you not eliminate, but if you can minimize the number of penalties and the number of turnovers and minimize special teams mistakes, that is a very achievable number with those two metrics. Number three, realistic goal. Number three, a top 60 recruiting class. May not have been expecting me to go with the off the field thing, but now that you've got this roster built, you can go back to a sort of normal-ish recruiting pattern. There may be a few extra guys that you got to get sorted out because you didn't bring in a ton of true freshmen this year. So you'll have to replace a few of the outgoing seniors just because you don't have enough true freshmen to backfill behind them. But and you'll probably have some transfers out too, because there's always a guy that'll stick around for a year, figure out maybe I should, maybe it's not going to work out, and then they leave, like that kind of thing. So you'll have a few departures the next season. And so when I guess high school class or transfer, I guess I mean a high school class, but I guess it's really kind of both. Kind of a combined transfer class in the top 60, basically. And this is not unachievable. This essentially would keep them right on par with where Matt Campbell was. Their last full class at Iowa State 2025 was 57. They've had a 54, like a 49, a 61. They've pretty much been hanging out in the 50 to 60 range pretty much the entire time. So just maintaining where you were recruiting wise and just allowing yourself to continue to be a developmental program with that kind of stuff, I think is still a viable path for Iowa State to be able to recruit at that level. Especially if this staff has more connections in Texas and Louisiana, places that have really, really good recruiting bases. They have, though they may have access to better players than they did before. When you're recruiting only or mostly the upper Midwest and then like some of Arizona, you may not have. You can develop those guys, but you might not have access to the same type of speed or the same type of caliber of player that you ordinarily would. And so is Iowa State still going to continue to get a lot of kids from like Ohio? Probably not. But they can get kids from Texas now. And if you got to pick one, you're probably going to take Texas. So I think they can. So Carter says I'm not keen keeping my hopes up this next recruiting cycle. New staff needs to establish themselves. It might not be established, not quite yet. I think that's fair, but I think let's all just have a nice frank conversation here. Matt Campbell did not set the bar particularly high recruiting wise. I mean, they did a good job with talent evaluation. But when you're talking about like landing highly coveted prospects, they didn't do a great job, especially in like this last class. They missed on tons of high level prospects. And does that mean that Jimmy Rogers and their staff are automatically going to be like that? They're going to be able to get those guys? I don't know. Not necessarily, but they can't. They're like the bar for high school recruiting at Iowa State was not moved like dramatically higher. I mean, it was moved up a little bit. They were able to start getting some better stuff, some better talent towards the end, but like, if we're going to be honest with ourselves, like, like I said, the last one was the 57th class. The 2022 class was 50. And that was one that had Greg Gaines and Hunter Deo, Jacob Imming. They had 3 4-stars in that class. If you go back to 2018, let's see here, 2018. So this is early Matt Campbell. They had the 55th class with 1 4-star. Let's go back to Paul Rhodes last year, 2015. They had the 62nd class. So the last year of Paul Rhodes, they were like the ranking didn't really get better under Matt Campbell. We may have found a better player, like their talent evaluation was better, but the recruiting ranking really didn't change much. I don't know. They just didn't land a lot of big prospects. And they said they found good players, but they didn't land a lot of necessarily big prospects. So a top 60 recruiting rating is all you're doing there is you're maintaining what last year of Paul Rhodes did. Like, like their 2014 class, 2014 class was 57th, and that had Alan Lazard in it. Alan Lazard and Terry Ianni, who I completely forgot about. Mike Warren. These like a top 60 recruiting class is not great, but it's also something that Matt Campbell did right. Like he was in that range regularly. He wasn't a demonstrably better recruiter than Paul Rhodes was. He may have been a better talent evaluator, but as far as like recruiting stars, which I know I don't want to like, I'm not transitioning to this like stars matter mindset. I'm not going to that. But what I am saying is that when you're looking at talent from a national perspective and how like most people view a lot of these guys, the recruiting classes didn't really change under Matt Campbell. And I believe that Jimmy, we're going to find out what kind of a talent evaluator Jimmy Rogers is, maybe even this year, because we're going to see these guys that they pulled up from Tristan Exline got pulled up from D2. They pulled up the kid from the Colorado School of Mines. They pulled up some kids from Tarleton State. We're going to find out how good of a talent evaluator the staff is pretty much right away, because you're going to have starters that played FCS and D2 football last year. And if they're good, then we can say, hey, this staff can evaluate talent. So for that reason, I don't think a top 60 recruiting class is like totally ridiculous or unachievable. I think that's very achievable. You might not do it the same way. Like you're not going to get kids from Ohio and Michigan and stuff like that, but you might get some from Texas. You might get some from Louisiana. You might get some more from Arizona. You might get, some from around, some from Minnesota or something like that. It's just a different recruiting area. That's all it is. That's all I have for realistic goals. I mean, there's a number of other things you could throw in here too. Like I was trying to limit it to kind of 3, but you could toss in kind of like some honorable mentions here. Like you have a couple first team players, maybe, or 1 or 2 first team players. And, maybe Bobby Terrell is in the top 5 in the conference in sacks or something like that. Like things that are very doable. We'll see what production looks like once we get to see the scheme on the field. Just because, like I said, the old defense was not very it wasn't very numbers friendly. It wasn't very counting stats friendly outside of tackles for the safeties. Basically, it didn't rack up a ton of interceptions or a ton of fumble recovery. It didn't turn people over a ton. It didn't sack people a ton. It didn't get tons of TFLs or anything like that. It just kind of just did its job basically, which is great. I mean, that's a great like standard to hold for a defense, but it wasn't a big numbers type of defense. So we'll kind of see how that goes.